Mercenaries massacre an entire village. Companies strip resources from protected lands. Former criminals train the armies of authoritarian regimes. This is what's happening in Africa right now, and it's all being perpetrated by Russia's secret militia. The Wagner Group, a private military contractor controlled by the Kremlin, has been using these brutal tactics in Central Africa. They have over 50,000 contractors and offer their services to ruthless authoritarian leaders, along with being responsible for numerous human rights violations and destabilizing governments. The incredible thing is that their tactics might be working. Russia is gaining more and more influence on the continent, and in the future, many African countries could come under the direct control of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. In order to understand how Russia is using the Wagner Group to control several countries in Africa, we must first examine who this band of mercenaries are and their ties to the Russian government. They're fueled by three things: money, resources, and power. In order to secure these objectives in Africa, the Wagner Group operates by always keeping Russian interests in mind. The organization itself has been working in Africa since at least 2017, but Russia's been exploiting certain African countries long before that. It was the Wagner Group's combat operations, security forces for hire, disinformation campaigns, gray zone tactics, and manipulation of the United Nations that have allowed its mercenary group to gain so much power and a strong footing on the African continent. Make no mistake, everything the Wagner Group is doing is either ordered by Putin and his close advisors or beneficial to the Russian government in some way. Unfortunately, what Russia normally wants comes at the expense of the African people. The Wagner Group was formed by a Russian oligarch named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is also known as Putin's chef. He got this name from the constant visits that the Russian president makes to his restaurants. These dinners are likely just a front for Prigozhin and Putin to discuss business behind closed doors. Currently, Yevgeny Prigozhin is sanctioned by the United States and most European governments, just like Vladimir Putin and the rest of his officials. The Wagner Group first appeared in 2014 during Russia's invasion of Crimea. It was here that reports of little green men accompanying the Russian military were seen torturing and killing Ukrainian citizens who opposed the annexation of their homeland. After the world allowed Russia to annex Crimea without any real consequences, the Wagner Group began to expand its operations to the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Since the Wagner Group was formed in 2014, the organization has grown immensely, thanks largely to the massive amount of support it receives from the Russian government. Even though the Kremlin denies any involvement with the Wagner Group, Russian leadership doesn't try especially hard to hide the actual truth. The organization has grown tremendously thanks to direct involvement of the Kremlin and having the Russian military's weapons, bases, and vehicles at their disposal. In recent years, it's been estimated that around 5,000 Wagner Group mercenaries have deployed to countries across Central Africa. The men sent to this region of the world by the Wagner Group are made up of former Russian soldiers, foreign nationals, and even convicts who have been hired for their deadly skills and unquestioning obedience in return for freedom and money. In January of 2023, the United States officially designated the Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization. Before discussing the tactics that the Wagner Group uses and the services they provide that shift the balance of power in Africa, let's examine where Russia has sent this secret militia force that they claim to know nothing about and that supposedly does not exist. Currently, the Wagner Group is conducting most of its operations in the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, and Sudan. However, their presence can also be found in Madagascar, Kenya, South Africa, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zimbabwe. In general, the Wagner Group is targeting nations that have rocky relationships with the West due to centuries of colonization and oppression. The Wagner Group also operates in countries with authoritarian rulers or governments that are in tumultuous situations. It's in these countries that the Wagner Group offers its services in exchange for concessions that benefit Russia. The Wagner Group has provided security services to some of the most brutal dictators and regimes in Central Africa, along with military training for their forces and disinformation campaigns to get the general public on their side. However, the Wagner Group will also act as an extension of the Russian military when need be. In 2019, leaked British intelligence documents showed that the Wagner Group had identified several countries that it would target for future operations in Africa. Most had autocratic governments that were losing power. What this shows is that the organization has plans to expand its influence in Africa even as Russia continues to lose the war in Ukraine. We'll come back to why this might be later, but it's important to note that wherever the Wagner Group is sent, pain and death will follow. The stability of Central Africa may be in jeopardy if Russia does not stop meddling in its affairs. Now let's look at what the Wagner Group is doing in these countries and how it's able to dominate the regions around Central Africa. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the Wagner Group's success is due to brutal tactics such as massacring entire villages, torturing anyone who stands against them, and leaving a wake of destruction wherever they go. Since the Wagner Group is technically a band of mercenaries for hire, the services they provide in each country vary based on the needs of the client that hires them. But it's not just authoritarian governments who are looking to secure the Wagner Group's services. They also work with rebel groups and terrorist organizations. Basically, as long as they get paid or the deal furthers Russian interests in the area, the mercenaries will lend their services to anyone who asks. The jobs they perform can vary, but pretty much everything the Wagner Group does in Africa can be categorized into 5 different subgroups. Number 1. Combat and military operations. The Wagner Group has provided mercenaries to both governments who are fighting rebel groups and rebel groups who are trying to overthrow governments in Africa. It's estimated that around 1,000 mercenaries were sent to the Central African Republic in 2018 to help defend President Faustin-Archange Touadéra's government against rebel attacks in the capital of Bangui. Touadéra's been trying to change the country's constitution to allow him to remain in power indefinitely, which would dismantle the democratic election process that was in place and formally turn it into an authoritarian government. This was one of the reasons why the Wagner Group was willing to offer Touadéra assistance in suppressing any dissent or uprisings. In return, Touadéra's government offered the Wagner Group, its subsidiaries, and by extension the Russian government, unrestricted logging rights in his country and control over the Ndasima gold mine, which is estimated to hold around 500 tons of gold, or the equivalent of around $2.7 billion or 2.5 billion euros. In return for limitless logging rights and a massive amount of gold, the Wagner Group has agreed to help President Faustin-Archange Touadéra stay in power by decimating any rebel groups or organizations that may threaten his rule. They've strengthened the current government's military exponentially, ensuring that no one can stand up to them. The deal has also forged closer ties between the Central African Republic government and the Kremlin. Mozambique sought out similar services from the Wagner Group in 2019. A group of rebels claimed the northern Cabo Delgado province was under the control of the Islamic State. This was a huge problem for the Mozambique government. The Wagner Group was hired to infiltrate the area and take out the rebels. However, just because the mercenaries are willing to do pretty much anything for money doesn't mean they're always effective. As fighting intensified, the Wagner Group realized they were in over their heads and decided to withdraw from the conflict. However, the organization still managed to further Russian interests and commit human rights violations while they were in the country. In Libya, the Wagner Group sent around 1,200 mercenaries to fight alongside Khalifa Hifter, a man who many have called Libya's most potent warlord. He's used his military leadership to oppose the Libyan government for years and has tried to claim control over the country through force several times. Hifter hired the Wagner Group to help him reach those goals, but without much success. The key here was that Hifter could pay, which was more than enough reason for the mercenaries to join in his failed conquest. In Mali, the Wagner Group has been accused of carrying out heinous crimes to help the anti-Western military junta gain power. Ever since the coup d'etat in 2020 and 2021, the transition of power has been tumultuous. The Russian-backed military leaders vying for power have encountered opposition, and the Wagner Group has helped further their cause in some brutal ways. In 2022, the Wagner Group executed 300 people in the rural town of Mura. Human Rights Watch concluded that although some of these people were soldiers, most were civilians, making the slaughter of the entire village one of the worst massacres the country had ever seen. The bodies were then buried near the Gossi military base, where French forces were getting ready to pull out of the region. Russia started a social media campaign that stated it was French soldiers who killed innocent civilians and put them in hastily dug graves. However, as the French were withdrawing, they conducted aerial surveillance that showed the Russian soldiers digging the graves and dumping bodies into them. So the Wagner Group was not just fighting to install a pro-Russian government in Mali, but also massacring civilians at the same time. However, human rights violations and combat support are not the only services the Wagner Group provides in Africa. They also offer other assistance to mold authoritarian regimes into governments that Russia can exploit. Number 2. Security and training. New authoritarian rulers or regimes that are growing often require security services and training to ensure they're not overthrown by other entities. The Wagner Group provides this support in exchange for money and resources. For example, in the Central African Republic, the Wagner Group served as President Faustin-Archange Touadéra's personal bodyguards while also training his army to suppress and combat a possible coup against his leadership. There are an estimated 1,890 Russian instructors that have provided training for government troops since the Wagner Group was hired. The Russian and Central African Republic governments are working closely to solidify the authoritarian rule of President Faustin-Archange Touadéra. The Wagner mercenaries drive around in unmarked vehicles to gather intel and forcibly stop any dissent they come across. The Wagner Group also conducts security for the nation's gold and diamond mines, which they almost certainly get a kickback from. Valery Zakharov is a Russian national and President Tuadera's national security advisor. He's also a key figure in the Wagner Group's command structure. This allows the organization to influence military decisions made by the Central African government and promote contracts that are beneficial for Russia and the Wagner Group. Both Putin and the Wagner Group leaders are exploiting the resources and the government of the CAR through the training and security services that they provide the Central African Republic. The Wagner Group has also been training troops in the Sudan military since 2017. They also guarded the country's mineral resources and made sure that President Omar al-Bashir was protected since the Kremlin already had close ties to his regime. While Omar al-Bashir was in power, Russia enjoyed access to the country's gold mines as long as they kept them protected. However, even when al-Bashir was removed from power, Russia used the Wagner Group to maintain control over key interests in the country. In February of 2022, while Russia was launching its initial invasion of Ukraine, Wagner Group members were loading a plane full of cookies in Sudan. The aircraft took off and landed along the coast of Syria, where it was inspected. The cargo manifest seemed odd to airport officials since the only thing listed was crates full of cookies. Upon inspection, the officials found a massive amount of gold lying just underneath the top layer of cookies. Before the plane could be seized, Russian military personnel stepped in and forcibly told officials there was nothing on the plane but cookies, so the Wagner Group members could continue on their way unimpeded. $2.85 billion in gold is exported from Sudan every year. Around 80% of that is believed to be smuggled out of the country rather than through traditional means. The Wagner Group takes advantage of the current status quo by offering security services for mines and stealing the gold for shipment back to Russia. However, Moscow also has ownership stakes in several mines in the country as well, meaning that a huge amount of gold is funneled out of the country through back channels that the Wagner Group provides to avoid paying the Sudan government. In order to ensure that business can continue as usual, the Wagner Group has continued to support and train the Sudanese military. Number 3. Disinformation campaigns. Another way that Russia has been able to maintain dominance in many African countries is by using the Wagner Group to conduct disinformation campaigns. It's been reported that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group, also owns the Internet Research Agency. This is a troll farm that floods websites, news outlets, and social media with information that furthers the Russian agenda. The Internet Research Agency worked with individuals in Ghana and Nigeria to feed the growing division in the United States during the 2016 presidential elections. The organizations also fueled anti-French and anti-Western sentiments in many Central African countries to try to drive the populations away from those ideologies. To be fair, many countries in Africa don't need much help to convince their people that Western nations can't be trusted, since there are people who grew up during a time when their country was still colonized by European powers. In fact, much of Africa didn't gain its independence until the 1960s. Djibouti finally became independent from France in 1977, and Zimbabwe was still a British colony until 1980. Therefore, it's hard for many people in these countries to trust Western nations, and Russia takes full advantage of this by using the Wagner Group to fuel anti-Western sentiment. The Wagner Group has also funded the building of statues and monuments that paint Russia in a positive light in Africa. For example, a statue built in the Central African Republic depicts Russian soldiers protecting a woman and her child. The organization has created films to show the public that they're on their side, sponsored beauty pageants, and handed out educational materials on how Russia is helping the countries of Africa. Russian is now being taught in some universities as a result of the Wagner Group's influence in certain areas. There have even been pro-Russian marches organized by the Wagner Group supporting the war in Ukraine while claiming Western powers that support Ukraine are enemies. This rhetoric also depicts France in a bad light. Not a hard task, as they're still seen as the former colonizer of the Central African Republic. The Wagner Group also provides security during those demonstrations to make sure their point gets across. When questioned by independent news agencies, it was uncovered that the government was paying some of the people participating in the pro-Russian rallies so they would join in. Number 4. United Nations manipulation. This is a two-way street for Russia. The Kremlin's been using the Wagner Group to influence the way some African countries vote in UN resolutions. This has helped Russia further its own agenda while also allowing the Wagner Group relatively free rein in many countries in Africa. The services the Wagner Group provides authoritarian leaders in Africa on behalf of Russia allows the Kremlin to sway the way they vote. For example, the combination of arms deals and aid sent to African countries, along with the presence of Wagner Group mercenaries in those nations, resulted in 15 African countries abstaining from the United Nations resolution vote against Russia's war in Ukraine. Eritrea and Mali both voted on Russia's side in the resolution. This means that African countries made up around half of the nations around the world that did not condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This clearly shows that the Wagner Group and the Russian government hold significant influence on the African continent. It is highly probable that Putin is using the Wagner Group to further spread Russian influence while reducing the power that Europe, the United States, and their allies hold in the United Nations. As of right now, Moscow has not completely succeeded in their goal, but it's clear that through utilizing the Wagner Group and different diplomatic tactics, many African countries are becoming closer to Russia than they are to Western powers. Number 5. Gray zone tactics. The use of gray zone tactics has allowed Russia to spread its influence in Africa. In fact, since the Kremlin maintains it has no ties to the Wagner Group at all, the organization itself can be viewed as an important weapon in the Russian arsenal of gray zone tactics. Put simply, gray zone tactics are non-military operations used to achieve political objectives or to strengthen the perpetrator's position. The Wagner Group most certainly uses deadly military force, but since they are technically not under the Russian government's control, the Kremlin has plausible deniability whenever they commit crimes against humanity or conduct illegal operations. The Wagner Group started as a military contracting company. However, it's grown and diversified over time. Now it has several subsidiaries, businesses, and networks that Russia can use to convince other governments to do what they want. Analysts at the Munich Security Conference concluded that the Wagner Group is really good at straddling the line between legal illicit activities and illegal ones. This has allowed Russia to conduct shady deals through the Wagner Group, allowing the Kremlin to separate itself from anything that could lead to further sanctions or backlash. Russia can't deploy troops to African countries to aid authoritarian rulers or overthrow governments without suffering some sort of consequence. Instead, Moscow uses the Wagner Group as their own secret army to do their dirty work in African countries. The Wagner Group has become one of the most effective tools in Russia's gray zone operations. Some have described the Wagner Group as a key Russian instrument of diplomacy in Africa, as Moscow uses the organization to either sway African politics in a way that benefits them or exploit a country for its resources. One of the most powerful things about the Wagner Group is that it's been able to get results for minimal cost. It's estimated that there are only a few hundred to a couple thousand mercenaries in any given African country, but the results they're getting are often not representative of their numbers. The scare tactics, brutality, and leveraging of Wagner Group assets have allowed the Russian government to expand its power by putting authoritarian leaders in control who will ally themselves with the Kremlin. All of this comes at a relatively little cost to the Russian government, thanks to the kickbacks from the people who seek out the Wagner Group services and the resources exploited by Russia during the deals. So, now that we know what the Wagner Group is doing in Africa and how it's allowed Russia to dominate certain countries on the continent, let's examine why what they are doing matters. Obviously, the exploitation and massacring of innocent people by the Wagner Group is something that the entire world should be aware of and want to stop, but there are some other sinister things happening behind the scenes as well. As mentioned before, the Kremlin uses the Wagner Group to maintain plausible deniability. This is done for a couple of reasons. The first is to avoid economic sanctions by other nations and backlash from organizations like the UN. However, Putin and his government also use the Wagner Group to hide any losses that would be seen as weaknesses of the Russian military. The war in Ukraine has shown that Russia's army is nowhere near as powerful as Putin claimed it was. And one of the reasons many people in Russia believed that taking Ukraine would not be a problem is because the Kremlin has hidden many past failures from the Russian public by using the Wagner Group to do their bidding. If the Wagner Group fails, it doesn't reflect poorly on the Russian government, since they have no formal connection to the Kremlin. Therefore, the Russian people who live under constant censorship by the government don't know that every time the mercenaries fail, it's really a secret branch of the Russian military failing. The Wagner Group also serves as a way for Russia to distance itself from human rights violations that would inevitably come with political backlash. For example, in 2019, when the Libyan National Army fought alongside Wagner mercenaries in their Tripoli campaign, things went really badly. It was uncovered that the soldiers and mercenaries had carried out executions at will and used landmines in civilian areas, which is a war crime under the Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons that came out of the Geneva Conventions. However, since there are no official ties between the Wagner Group and the Russian government, the Kremlin avoided any repercussions, even though the Wagner Group was in the country to look after Russian interests. But Russia can also use the Wagner Group in other ways, such as conducting arms sales. The organization was found to be supplying Sudan's Rapid Support Forces militia with missiles to combat the Sudanese army, as the former benefited Russia more in the long run. In July of 2022, it was uncovered that the deal the Wagner Group made with President Faustin Archange Touadera over the logging rights in the Central African Republic gave Russian companies access to 722 square miles or 1,870 square kilometers of land. These companies have no plans to cut down the forests in a sustainable way, and the deal will result in habitat loss for hundreds of species while also contributing negatively to the environmental crisis already threatening our planet. Central African governments are finding that paying the Wagner Group with natural resources and land is much easier on their own coffers than paying them with cash. However, the result is that Russia is gaining control of more and more land in Africa. It then exploits the African people for cheap labor and strips their nation of natural resources. Russia is also using the Wagner Group to force Western companies out of Africa. For example, the French sugar company SUCAF, which operates out of the Central African Republic, is being pushed out by the Wagner-supported government. The same is happening to the French brewery Castel. The Wagner Group framed the French company, stating it was using its profits to fund terrorist forces. In reality, Russia itself is manipulating how business is done and the perceived realities in the Central African Republic and other nations on the continent. All of the economic benefit that the Wagner Group is procuring in Central Africa directly helps the Russian economy as well. Russian companies that are given mining contracts or take over Western businesses in Africa funnel the money back to Moscow, which is then used for things like funding their war against Ukraine. The Russian government and the Wagner Group may put on the guise of helping African governments and their people, but they really are just providing services and manipulating politicians to increase their own influence and profits. What has many around the world concerned is that if the Wagner Group continues to meddle in African affairs or exploit certain countries, it could lead to instability in the region. On top of that, if the Wagner Group does succeed in placing or keeping authoritarian rulers in power that then ally themselves with Russia, it could mean trade and diplomatic deals that Western nations have in place could be threatened. The tragic part is that the African people are the ones hurt most by Russia using Wagner Group mercenaries to protect their interests and to install oppressive authoritarian rulers in Africa. After centuries of colonization by Europe, Africa now finds itself with another major power meddling in its affairs for their own benefit. People are being killed and the natural resources of the continent are being robbed without regard for what it'll do to the ecosystems and the economies of the African nations. Russia is using the Wagner Group as soldiers, security for hire, and disinformation agents in Africa. And if things continue as they have been for the past several years, a large percentage of the countries on the continent may strongly ally themselves with Moscow in the years to come. Now watch Honest Look at the state of the Russian military, or check out why Putin runs his own private army, the Wagner Group.